Hi, I would like to welcome you all to Student Voices inside SCMA. My name is Lauren Shea Warner, and I am the Membership Engagement and Stewardship Coordinator. Today's program features Mosa Molapo, Class of 22, and April Gallant, Mary Walcott Keys, Class of 1931, Curator of Print, Drawing, and Photograph, Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs. Ooh, it's a long title. Next slide, please. Before I hand this over to our panelists, I did want to go over a few housekeeping items. Can you actually go to the next slide, Louise? Thank you. So there's a Q&A box where you will put in any questions you may have, or also on Facebook Live. You can also put in questions under the live video. Mosa and April will be following along and look forward to answering any questions you may have. And I will now turn it over to April.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I'm happy to be here. My name is April Gallant. I'm the Mary Walcott Keyes 1931 Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs and Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs at the museum. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mosa Molapo. Mosa is currently serving as the Kennedy Museum Research Fellow in Art History at SCMA, a position that's designed to give a substantive research opportunity to an art history major, and which is co-funded by the Smith Art Department and SCMA. A member of the class of 2002, Mosa will graduate in May with a double major in art history and African studies. Mosa self-designed their African studies major. Smith officially only offers a minor in African studies and is currently finishing an honors thesis on African futurism. Mosa will begin a master's program in art history at Oxford University this fall. Mosa has worn many hats at SCMA over their 4 years at Smith, including working as a student assistant in the collections management department, organizing a student PICS exhibition, and serving as a digital initiatives intern in the summer of 2020. Their work at SCMA this year focused on the 2020 gift of 100 photographs by women artists from the collection of Joe Baio and Anne Griffin, class of 1983. In addition to researching individual artists in the collection, Mosa was tasked with developing a proposal for an acquisition that would enrich both the Baio collection specifically and the SCMA collection as a whole. Mosa will now tell you more about the process. So please join me in welcoming Mosa Molapo.
Thank you for the introduction, April. So today, as mentioned, I'll be talking about my work as a museum fellow and how this has led to the acquisition of a new work for the collection that is both in conversation with the Baio collection and also the Greater SCMA collection. Next slide, please. So as was mentioned, the Baio collection is a collection of photographs donated by Joe Baio and Anne Griffin, and it consists of 100 photographs by women artists. So to contextualize the collection a bit more, it predominantly features European and American artists with some Japanese and Latin American artists. And although there is a wide range of photographs and photographic subjects, the general themes that we were able to pull out from this collection mainly revolve around girlhood, childhood, womanhood, growth, and also intimacy. So because of the fact that all these works are new to the SCMA collection, part of my work as a fellow included creating new artist files and records to document them. And the importance of these records is so that they're available for future research and reference for both students and also museum staff and curators that would potentially use them in the future. And earlier this year, I wrote a post on the SCMA blog post, on the SCMA blog, initially introducing the collection, and I featured and talked a bit about the photograph by Jill Greenberg, which we see on the far left. Next slide, please. So in my next step as a fellow, I was prompted to think a bit more intentionally about how the future acquisition can interact with the Baio collection and the SCMA collection, but also how and if there's a meeting ground, which there is, between the two collections. And so I began my search by initially just thinking about who's being represented in these images, and it's mostly women and girls, but I didn't want to just limit myself to searching for a photograph that just so happened to include a femme subject. And so as a result, a theme that kind of propelled me forward was thinking about how intimacy and closeness and is referenced in images and in photographs. So as a result, the acquisition that I ended up looking at, which I will talk about a bit later, touched upon intimacy between girls and this growing up phase and kind of the transitions that happen between girlhood and womanhood. Next slide, please. So just to jump a little bit, I was thinking about how collage as an artistic medium is interesting to think about. And I'm mainly drawn to collage because I think that it demands an intentional approach to like using different mediums and also like a prolonged viewing of a work, just because all the different images that are included. So the SCMA collection already has some artists that work with collage, such as Joyce Lightbody, Wangechi Mutu, Joanne Leonard, as shown on the screen from left to right. And I think that the privilege of slowing down and looking at a work is something that I was inspired by because I think that in an expansive collection like the SCMA, which already has so many different works and so many different amazing works, there is something really amazing about being able to just slow down and look more closely, as I've been saying. And the questions that kind of guided me in like the acquisition process were first asking what perspectives are not represented in the Baio collection, and also what would I be excited to see in the SCMA collection. So as mentioned, the perspective represented in the collection are primarily European and American. So as an African studies and art history double major, my primary focus and primary interests mainly revolve around African and Black diasporic art that questions and examines Black history, identity, joy, violence, and experiences in visual culture. So as a result, when I was asking myself the question of what I would be excited to see in the SCMA collection, the immediate answer was one that revolved around Blackness. So next slide, please. So Andrea Chang is an artist that I was vaguely familiar with before actually pursuing the acquisition. And my first interaction with Andrea Chang was through her exhibition titled Anthropocene, which was a series of large-scale cyanotype prints of lionfish, which are really beautiful. However, in this new series of work that I was prompted to look at, she dives intimately into like Black identity and Black diasporic experiences. But before I get into that discussion, I just want to talk a bit about Andrea Chang. And she was born in 1978 in New Jersey. And through a variety of different mediums, Chang's research-based practice focuses primarily on island nations in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. And she explores labor and materials and their relationship to post-colonial countries, the body, and migration, which also involves perishable and precious materials with strong underlying histories, which she really intentionally and consciously includes in her works. And so she also earned her BFA from Parsons School of Design and her MFA from the Maryland Institute of College of Art. And so next slide, please. Thank you. So this acquisition comes from Chang's recent exhibition, We Was Girls Together, which was on view at Tyler Park Presents Gallery. And the work is inspired by Toni Morrison's book, Sula. And for those of you who are unaware, I mean, Sula is this beautiful book by Morrison that talks about Black femininity and Black girlhood and dealing with very intimate friendships. So the work makes direct references to these kind of dynamics within Black friendships, Black female friendships specifically. And so the body of work is a series of large-scale collages that celebrate and pay gratitude to the nuanced relationships of Black women in all their complexities. And in each piece in We Was Girls Together, it depicts ethnographic photographs pulled from historical archives of women in familial relationships, friendships, and partnerships. And this is collaged with a plethora of flora, shells, rhinestones, beads, and pins. Next slide, please. Just to take a closer look, I think if you look closely, you can see about like the arrangement of materials that I was referencing. And in both her previous and this current series of collage works, Chung places the figures present in the work with a protective barrier so that there's sealed beneath the, like behind the gloss. And they're also used driving pins, like to pin all the image, to pin all the elements down. And Chung makes further reference to her own Caribbean background, and she references orishas, which are essentially spiritual guides, spiritual Caribbean guides that take reference from African mythologies, but which have been transformed by like the diaspora and how that has moved. So she makes reference to these like spiritualities and mythologies in the specific beads that she uses, and the specific colors that she decides to use in her works. And I think that Andrea Chang's work is already in conversation with some of the collage artists that I mentioned before and could add to this growing collection of collage pieces. Next slide, please. And just looking at even more intimately at the detail of this piece, I will specify that it's a diptych. So there are these huge pieces that come together and they're supposed to be displayed together. And just to talk a bit more, according to like the SCMA's most recent collecting plan, two of the priorities in building the collage collections were to also acquire contemporary artists in the collage practice and to expand the collection of works significantly by women practitioners and also artists of color. And so I just think that it's also interesting to think about how this piece interacts with like a greater collection plan as well as the museum. And I was just really excited to work on this piece because I think it's exciting to think about how a collection can be built and also involving students that are going to be working intimately with these pieces for years to come. So also just to put this in conversation with the Baio collection, it can also be read from the Baio collection pieces because it also touches on similar themes of girlhood, femininity, and identity. Next slide, please. So when I was initially thinking about the acquisition of this work, I was thinking that the work can potentially be used and should be used by departments from classes that include Africana Studies, Studio Arts, Anthropology, African Studies, and even botany and other biological sciences. And I just think that, for instance, even in Africana Studies and English classes, Sula is a book that's regularly taught, and Morrison's book is a book that's on many a syllabus across campus and across departments. So I was thinking about how it is, like what it means to also have a visual aid and also a visual comparison when you're studying these literary works, and how artists like Andrea Chang are creating this kind of conversation and archive of like Black visual works that's interacting with literature. And yes, so initially just some final reflections as like I was nearing the end of this acquisition was just the expansiveness of how broad the prompt was, because initially when I started my work as a fellow and when I was talking to April, she didn't put any sort of barriers on how I could approach the acquisition, which made it quite difficult because, as you can imagine, there's a plethora of artists and Black artists and Black women artists out there that are dealing with diasporic works. And I think it was helpful because Andrea Chang has also done some work with the SCMA, so she's already a familiar figure within the Smith College Museum of Arts kind of network. And I just really excited about this piece, and I'm happy to take any further questions and just talk more with April about how this acquisition came together and also my experiences as a fellow. Thank you.
Thanks, Mosa. That was great. It's good to hear you talk about the work, which we're so excited about. I mean, we're really thrilled with this acquisition. You picked a really great piece. So I'm curious about, I love the fact that you focus on intimacy as a quality that you were looking for. Were you thinking about that when you were looking broadly, or was it when you started seeing works that you that really resonated with you, that the word intimacy sort of became part of your thought process?
I think it was definitely the latter of it, because like the more I studied a lot of the photographs, the more it kind of felt like there was this really like intimate way of like looking in, just looking in into how certain like photographic subjects were like transitioning from girlhood to womanhood, or like the playfulness in some of the images. And I think when I like in my research project, in my research process, like when I decided that intimacy was one of my criteria, it made it easier because I was able to narrow it down from like choosing artists that tended to take like a more voyeuristic kind of approach to documenting subjects versus those that felt really connected to the works that they were documenting. So Andrea Chang's a really great example because she is also Caribbean, and like her, like she's Caribbean and Caribbean American. So she also is able to work with these archives and has, I think, a kinship to the women that she's choosing to collage with. And unfortunately, we don't know their names. But I think that she's doing this kind of rescuing them from the archive, because a lot of like ethnographic colonial archives are quite violent in the sense that they're documenting people sometimes without their will, or we don't know the parameters of like the reasons why they were being documented. So I was just looking for artists that were having like a really intimate connection to their work instead of people who were taking a step back in a sense.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And also I love, like, collage really is also a very intimate medium, because you're really sort of like relating, disparate things to each other. So, and I never thought about that. So thank you for that line of inquiry. So the artist doesn't really know anything about the people in the photographs themselves, but do you know where the photographs came from? Like, do you have any information about like what the source was?
No, I don't actually. And I think that's like a conversation that I'll like definitely have with the artists, and like will be recorded in like future record files, because even though I am an African studies major, I think most of my work doesn't really revolve around looking at like the more anthropology, like archival work in a sense. Like I have a more contemporary focus. So I couldn't really pinpoint what the where the photographs were coming from. But I think what's interesting, which I didn't mention in my presentation, is that how she makes the paper that she uses to collage with. And it kind of, from what I've read about it, it's referencing like a specific like birthing cloth that is used by Congolese people and also like Black diaspora people. So there's this whole like practice that's integrated into her work, which like further just makes more connections. So I think it's a very like diasporic work, because there's no one place. Like, even though these photographs they're definitely from a specific place, like the blend of the collage elements and the birthing cloth and the combination of her own identity make it something that's constant, like in the in between. So I think it works in both locations, which I was really drawn to. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So here's a question. Wondering if you could talk about the other artists you considered before deciding to pursue the piece by Andrea Chang, and what considerations affected your decision making?
Sure. Like I looked at a lot of other artists, like Deborah Jones, to name a few, like Tony Gum, and some of the artists. Well, I think that, I mean, honestly, some of the artists, like their work wasn't available. So that was also like a technical barrier. And that's also something that was interesting, like a learning curve in terms of how, like I can be out there pursuing works and looking for acquisitions, but there's also like a greater commercial contemporary art world that I also have to think about in my whole search. And I also looked at Tony Gum, which is a contemporary South African photographer as well. And I think in looking at other international artists, my thought was to also make like the SCMA collection a bit more international focused, because it's quite American focused, which does make sense. But I was kind of drawn to I was more drawn to Andrea Chang, because I think she had such an interesting in-between stage. So my work kind of started narrowing down to like more diasporic artists, and also Naomi Joven is also an upcoming artist that I looked at. But I was just also fascinated because Andrea Chang built her whole collection around Sula, around Toni Morrison. So I'm always just thinking about how there's a very obvious connection between literature and visual arts. So she's one of the artists that did that really explicitly, versus other artists kind of had a body of work that was focusing on a specific thing and wasn't really as connected to literature. So I loved how she referenced Toni Morrison as well. And yeah, made those kind of dynamics really explicit.
Yeah. So it's sort of also connecting across generations with literature. And so that's a great detail. So here's another question. So could you say more about what you learned about the process that unfolds in a museum around researching and making an acquisition? And was there anything that surprised you?
Well, I definitely learned like the technical aspects of it, how I had to go through several rounds and like talking with various different people and different curators. And I think that I also learned how much museums, like how much there's actually a network between museums and galleries, just because previously, like before I had worked at the SCMA, maybe I naively thought that there was just quite a separation between them. But looking at how like a lot of like April and Emma and like a lot of the different curators already had pre-existing relationships with galleries was really interesting, because I think that sometimes people think of them as two really separate entities in terms of how one is an educational space, as is the SCMA, and then one can be a really commercial space that's existing like in the realm of auction houses and gallery openings in like a very distinct kind of context. But there's like a lot more overlap. And also thinking about how, I mean, the collection was initially donated by Joe Baio and Anne Griffin, who's a former Smith alum. So thinking about how there's also a dynamic in terms of how you also have collectors who are so generous to like further add to the collection, which just leads to projects like these. So I like the biggest thing I learned was like this like interconnected kind of network that happens between gallerists and museum curators and also collectors, which was really fascinating, because it's not something that I previously like really considered in like with a deep consideration, I suppose.
Yeah, so there's another question that came in that specifically focuses on the Baio collection. It says, I'm curious about the Baio collection. Can you tell me more about it?
Sure, yes. So it's a really expansive collection. Like it's mostly contemporary, I will say, but there are some pieces from like the 19th century and mostly 21st century. And it includes artists who they're all women. And I think that it's really difficult to kind of define a collection by just being by specifically women artists, because the womanhood that's represented in the collection is so vast and differing. So it's not like when we put that category of woman artists, it's not to make like an essentialist argument. It's just mainly just to kind of bind them in this general sense. So the collection, yeah, it's really beautiful. It talks a lot about girlhood and womanhood and growth. And I think a conversation that April and I had and that we had before like initially going into the collection was also what it means to have children, because it has a lot of images of children. So also what it means to have children represented in photographs and like questions of consent and everything. But then I think that just propelled me to think more about intimacy and like also how children experience intimacy as well. And just like how girlhood is really challenging in a lot of specific ways. So yeah, the collection is really beautiful in that sense. And it's really wide ranging, because there are some images that will have like a straight portrait, but then others will like have group shots and like self-portraits. So there's a wide range of images in the collection that was interesting to look at, and it's interesting that I ended up with this acquisition in the end, because it seems so different, but also so similar in a lot of ways to the collection itself, which I think is important.
Yeah, so that's specifically the portion of the Baio collection that was donated to the museum was all women artists, but the Baio collection itself is much larger and represents, male and female artists from around the world, and does focus a lot on the same subjects as the ones that are in our collection of children and adolescents. So it's kind of we've got a small subset of a much larger vision. And so it's a really interesting thing to, because collectors have such a big role in helping build museum collections. It's kind of nice to be able to, reflect a mini collection within our collection, and then also build on it as you've done with your acquisition. So I'm actually curious about, how has your work at the museum and this experience in particular informed your plans for the future, like your future goals?
So I am intending on pursuing my master's, as you mentioned, and I think that I think it just inspired me to be like more explicit about focusing on Black art, because I think previously well, Black art, but also African art specifically, because previously I think that I kind of not cornered myself, but I was very focused on having this broad approach to like studying Black art. But I think that that's even difficult in itself, just because there's so many different variations of Black art, and it just made me consider that I can also study African art like solely, like obviously in conversation with diasporic Black art, but when I was studying Andrea Chang's work, I was just, I think I was really struck by how she has a very specific like geographic focus, but that's also on the in-between. So like hopefully in graduate school, I'm hoping to just speak more about African art and not be so coy about it, because I think that sometimes I'll say that I just study contemporary art, but if I study Black art, I study Black art, and that's fine. And it seems kind of like it seems like kind of a silly thing to kind of come to realization, but I think that like as I grow up and as I go more into studying, I can have a really explicit focus and not worry about like how this may fit into an institution that may not have like the resources that I need or that I want, but then I can build from that space, and like I can build pockets for my own self.
Well, thank you. Yes, actually, that your answer leads right into the next question in a really nice way. A viewer says that they're struck by your reflection on future students engaging with the work. What other perspectives did you gain through this experience about the significance of collecting works of art in the context of a college museum specifically?
Well, I think that if the SCMA wasn't an educational museum, I don't think I would have actually settled on this piece. And I think that I was also searching for an acquisition that can also be viewed to the general public, because students aren't the only one using the museum. So that was another parameter in mind, because it was a new one in mind, because I'm a student, so my focus towards art is very student kind of base as well. So yeah, I think if I wasn't at the SCMA, I wonder if this piece would have been more conceptual or abstract, or something that doesn't actually explicitly reference like things like literature and things in our immediate, just because I think a lot of like contemporary and like abstract conceptual art can be like pushing the limits of like form and also like themes and like its subject in itself. So I was actually thinking about like figures and people that we can look at and relate to. So hopefully that answers the question, but yes.
Yeah, but I also, I mean, it makes me think about, you were talking about, as a student being sort of bound by what you have access to. And so how this kind of expands access to future students. So collecting really is, it's a conversation that you're having with future students, which is one of the things I've always loved about collecting. So I'm curious if there are, through this experience, if there are other areas of collecting that you think the museum should be looking into.
I definitely think that the museum could expand like the international focus. And I mean, I study African art, so I may be a bit biased, but I do think that like more contemporary African artworks could be like really beneficial to the museum, and also more contemporary indigenous artwork, which the museum does have quite a few amazing pieces. But just thinking about like artists that have typically been like on the periphery of art historical studies, and like marginalized in that sense, like being brought into the fold. But I think it's interesting because I don't necessarily think that that means we should stop collecting like European works of art and American works of art, because I think that a collection needs every aspect of that. But just shifting like what gets prioritized, I think it would be interesting to think of like bringing more like indigenous artwork into the fold and also Black art. And yeah, just how that, I think that would really augment the collection even more so.
Yeah. So, and also was this, have you deeply engaged with photography before this experience, either in your studies or kind of just out there looking at art, or was this something new for you?
I think I had engaged with photography, but mostly I'd looked at like painting and drawings. But I mean, I had engaged with photography to a certain amount. I think photography is a really interesting medium because I think it's the easiest medium to engage with, in the sense that it feels the most accessible. Like if you have a camera, like you will have access to photography, and it's not a medium that requires, or in a basic sense, it's not a medium that requires a lot of resources in the same way that like oil painting or printmaking will. So I'm also really drawn to the accessibility element of photography that comes from it. And I think that's why I think it would be so much like easier in a sense to collect photographs from like people with marginalized identities, because it's a medium that feels so accessible to a lot of people. So I had engaged with photography, but I mean, after this experience, I'll definitely be looking a bit more critically at it, because I think there's so much to learn from it still.
Yeah. So one of the things that you've mentioned that obviously warms my heart wonderfully is how important it was for you to do a student picks exhibition, which is students enter a lottery, and if their name is chosen, they get to organize an exhibition out of the Works on Paper collection. And so you did that when I think it was in your second year. Yeah, and the subject was futurism, which is the subject of your honors thesis. So I'd love to sort of hear about how your ideas and studies of futurism have blossomed over the years.
Yeah, so actually the student picks exhibition was like one of my favorite things I've actually done at Smith. And I mean, like you said, it's really just by chance. So I was just lucky to be chosen for that specific month. And I remember I kind of like, I didn't come to the topic by myself. I was actually helped by the postdoc fellow at the time, Shanice. And because I was talking to her about how like I was feeling really frustrated with the way that African art was presented in general, but also in the collection, just because there wasn't so much of a contemporary element. So I wanted something more future facing. And she mentioned Afrofuturism and African futurism as like this genre and movement that quite literally embodies everything that I felt was lacking. So it was quite interesting, and she like pushed me to like look at works in the collection that, you know, we're not explicitly like Afrofuturistic, because it's really hard to have that label in the collection because it feels so new, but did like contend with like futurism and contend with Blackness. And so from there, I kind of like, I moved into my junior year and then my senior year thinking about my thesis and how I wanted to talk a bit more about like that futuristic elements the futuristic elements in Afrofuturism / African futurism, and like how Black artists are actually approaching how they want to be depicted in the future and how that coincides with technology and art. And I think I was even more so drawn to Afrofuturism and African futurism just because I really do love science fiction. And then like growing up and consuming science fiction works, I didn't always feel quite represented. So when I stumbled, when Shanice, actually I should give her credit, like when Shanice like pointed me towards Afrofuturism and African futurism, I felt so seen in the genre, because I think that even though it's like a subset of fiction that technically has no bounds, it sometimes feels quite restricted. But then when you look at how Black artists, like Black artists, queer artists, women artists, like approach science fiction and approach like the visual elements of it, it's so expansive. So I really kind of just owe like my thesis building to like to the student picks in a sense, because during that experience, I also had to look at the collection a lot more intimately, because it was the first time I'd had to really interact with the collection, because even though I was working in the museum as an assistant to the registrar, my job didn't so much revolve around really pinpointing specific works. Like it was more admin focused, which was really interesting in itself. So yeah, that's been the development of my like path with African futurism. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to hear about that, and I'm looking forward to sort of hearing your presentation on your thesis. So we do have one final question, and so you said something about the fact that flowers in the piece could be interesting for biology classes. Do these classes also use the museum collection?
Well, the museum collection is open to any professor who would like to use it. And I think I made that point just because I think when we think of botany and biology, we don't often think about like how political it is in a sense, like what plants and flowers do get collected, what plants and flowers are considered important enough to like be transported across nations and like be named in specific ways. So when I made that point, I made the point of like just thinking about like the political aspects of botany and also what it means to integrate this flower and plant into this ethnographic collage and put it in conversation with that. So yeah, and if any like biology professors or like botany professors were interested in using the piece, it would be so readily available to them. But I mean, that's why I love the piece. I just think it like intersects so many different departments, and it's not just something that lives within like an art discipline. I think it's so beautifully expansive in that way.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we're fortunate that we have, I mean, we have very adventurous students and professors that love to mine this collection. We do have biology classes that come into the Cunningham Center frequently. And Charlene Chang Miller, who is our educator for academic programs, is always out there finding new people to encourage to come into the museum. So I think hopefully there will be biology courses that will come in and use this piece. And I'm dying to get it on view. So we're thrilled to have it in the collection, and really, Mosa, appreciate all of the work that you did into pulling this acquisition together. Particularly sort of, as you said, because it was a very sort of like wide-ranging project where you weren't given very many directives, but I think you really landed in kind of an amazing place. And starting with your idea of bringing together the SCMA collection and the Baio collection and being able to link them together in one acquisition, which is kind of a tall order. So I apologize sort of for giving you that topic, but you executed it so beautifully that that I appreciate all your hard work. So I don't know that there are any more questions. This is sort of last call for questions, because I think we're probably going to have to wrap up soon. So is there anything that we haven't talked about, Mosa, that you want to say before we close?
No, I mean, nothing that's come to mind. I feel like it's been really cathartic to talk about it, like in a formal setting, because I feel like it's just been you and I kind of talking about it and the curators. So you know, it was just a really amazing experience. And yeah, I mean, I really hope that people do learn from it, and I hope that I can see it on view one day, because it's really impressive in real life. And I think that the images are impressive, but they don't actually capture what it's like to see it in person. Because even in person, it feels like it's a huge piece. I don't think I mentioned the size of it, but it just really draws you in. So yeah, I hope that people will flock to see it, and just also like thank you for the experience of it. I just really loved this project, and a long year, but a good one.
Well, thank you, Mosa. We really appreciate, like I said, all the hard work you put into it, and we will definitely get it on view. And actually, so whenever the Cunningham Center is open, people can request to view it, and hopefully we will have it on view in the galleries very soon. So I think now I will turn it back over to Lauren for our wrap up. But thank you, Mosa, for your work and for this great presentation.
Thank you.
So thank you all so much. And thank you, Mosa and April, for this amazing presentation, and Louise Krieger behind the scenes. Please stay tuned for information on our social media or also on our website for more information about upcoming museum happenings later this spring and summer. Finally, I wanted to thank our fabulous members and donors who make programs like this possible. If you are not a member or have a question about membership, please go to our website for more information. We hope to see you again. Thank you so much.